So my name is James Hill, and I'm a photographer. And I've been working more or less since 1991, when I left England and went to live in the former Soviet Union. And when I started, I was just a freelance photographer, trying to pick up assignments. And I was very lucky that I ended up in Kiev, because it was a place which had very few photographers working. And when I was living in Ukraine, I had my first assignment for the New York Times in 1993. And 2 years later, they offered me a contract and moved me to Moscow. And I've been working as a contract photographer ever since, as well as working also for a wide range of American and European publications. So I got into photography, I would say, a little bit by accident. There are some people who have a very clear understanding of what they want to do and how they will achieve the possibility to do that. I studied history at Oxford, and when I left university, I actually had a position in a bank in London. And I didn't so much know what I wanted to do, but I knew that I didn't want to do that. So I traveled for a year in Australia, New Zealand, and Asia, and I came back, and I worked as a history teacher for a year. And in that time, a fellow student from Oxford, we decided that we wanted to try a hand at photojournalism. So we applied for a course at the London College of Printing. And we did that for a year, and it gave us a possibility to try being photojournalists without the pressure of having to make a living from it. And this was in 1991. So when I left there, I managed to get a visa to the Soviet Union, thinking that my career probably wouldn't last more than a few months and I'd have to come back to the UK and do a real job. But I managed, sometimes by luck, sometimes by having a little bit of skill, to get work. And surely but slowly, I managed to build up a range of clients, most importantly the New York Times, and that more or less secured my position as being a photojournalist. So if I have to think of one photograph that marked the beginning of my career, I would say it's a photograph that I took in Nagorno-Karabakh, where I went in February 1992. It was the first time I'd gone to a conflict zone. And of course, in those days, when we were shooting slide film, I wasn't shooting on a digital camera, so you couldn't see what was in the camera, what the quality of the pictures you had taken. And in fact, when I got the pictures back, I was very disappointed, but there was one picture there which stood out, which was of a wounded man being brought to a hospital. And the fact that there was a picture there which really stood out, that had a certain quality, it made me believe that I was going to be able to take pictures in these difficult circumstances and that they had the ability to continue. I won the Pulitzer Prize for my work in Afghanistan in 2001. I was one of a team of 5 photographers from the New York Times. And I arrived in late September 2001. This was about 3 weeks after the attack in New York. And I stayed there through till just before Christmas, when Karzai was made president. And it was a very powerful and moving experience to be there for basically 3 months and working day in, day out on a story which was appearing on the front pages of the New York Times and in many magazines around the world. And it was a very complicated and difficult story. It was very dangerous at times as well, but I was very motivated by it. And also, when you work every single day on a difficult story, the quality keeps on improving. And so when I look back on that work, it seems to me to be probably the very best work that I've done in my career. Working in conflict zones is a very complicated business in many ways. I think principally because photographers have an awkward position in a conflict zone, because on one hand you have the soldiers and then you have the civilians, you have people who are described as being participants. And you are somebody who is physically there, but you are somehow on the outside of the story. And so you have this awkward distance between you and the images that you're taking. And also, even though you're supposed to be on the outside, of course, the images you're taking, where are they going? They're going directly through your camera into your head. And you have to digest this on a daily basis. So I've always found it a complicated business to be working in these zones, not only merely because of the immediate physical danger, but also of how you react with the people that you photograph and the people who are going through such terrible pain, either physically or emotionally. and then digesting that yourself, not only at the time when you were there, but also afterwards, about the fact that you fly into a place or you drive into a place and then you leave it, and how you have to live with those images. It's something which is, I would say, the most complicated aspect of any kind of work for a photojournalist, and to this day it's something which I'm constantly thinking about, even if I don't necessarily feel pain thinking about it. Nonetheless, these are moments which constantly come back to me. I left England in 1991 and I haven't gone back to live there, and I've had the enormous richness of working in many different countries. So I started originally in Ukraine, where I spent 4 years before moving to Moscow. Then I went to Italy. Italy is a place where I covered the funeral of the Pope, and I got a lot of stories such as tuna fishing in Sicily, things which really got to me, to the heart of the culture there. Then I went back to Russia. Again, Russia's the place where I've done 3 books, including a book about Russian veterans, World War II, a general book on Russia. And then 3 years ago I moved to France, and we're here in the home of my wife, which was also the source of another book called The Castle. So each country in its different way has given me something. And even countries that I visited, such as Spain, I went and did a story for the Spanish government about bullfighting. So one of the pleasures of being a photographer is the fact you get to travel and you get to experience these different cultures and you get to photograph them, and that's a very enriching process. I think that every artist, perhaps artist is a big word to use as a photographer, goes through different periods. You're affected by the place that you're living, by the people you're living with. And right now I feel that I'm much more interested in very different things. I'm interested in things that have more beauty in them. So right now I'm actually working on 2 personal projects. I'm working on a project about the forest which exists outside the house we're in right now. And I'm also doing a project about clouds taken from the balcony of the apartment we're living in Paris. And the reason I'm doing that is there was this book called The Shock of the New by Robert Hughes, the Australian critic. And he talked about how electrifying the view was from the Eiffel Tower when it was first built, by this idea of perspective. So what I mentioned now are in fact different perspectives I have on things that I find beautiful, things that I find comforting, and that's on the personal side. And I'm still working on far more dramatic stories for the New York Times. But on a personal level, I'm interested in very different things to what I was interested in 30 years ago. Every time I approach a project, I think of the way which is the best way to capture what I'm looking for. And when I did the Castle project, I felt very convinced it had to be in black and white. Why black and white? Because this is a house that has existed for 6 centuries. So I wanted something that had a very timeless feel to it. And for that I felt like it had to be in black and white. And not only in black and white, but also on film. And in particular, I felt like shooting that on medium format with mostly a Rolleiflex. It was also just the tactile nature of working that story in black and white that energized me to do it, and also made me feel like I was capturing something which would blend very well with a place where there's so much history. Now my attention has turned to doing something about the forest, and there I decided to shoot that in color and digital. I'm looking for something where I can capture the vibrancy of the forest, also the seasons, how the colors change, same place but different colors, different moods, and the black and white wouldn't have the range to do that. So every project for me has something different in it, and to capture that essence I need to do it in a different way. So the Bestland story is probably the story which has been the most painful for me. I was actually in France when this event started, when Chechen terrorists took this school in southern Russia, and I flew back to Moscow and I flew down to Bestland. We were landing just as the storm started, so the plane went somewhere else, and I arrived that evening having missed the whole event. But basically over 330 people were killed, mostly children. And the next day I went around the morgues, and it was a really shocking thing to go and see. And it made such a deep effect on me that I felt like I had to come back 2 weeks later to understand what was going on in this place, to understand how the people there were were living going forward. And I shot that in a completely different way. I shot that on medium format, black and white. And I shot a mixture of portraits and of scenes from the school, number one, where the tragedy had happened. And it was a very moving event for me. And I think that the pain which I witnessed and also the emotional effect that it had on me translated into the images, which is probably why those pictures, the ones that won the most awards from World Press Photo, Visa d'Or, Bestland, these are the pictures which have been the most awarded in my entire career. But it was also the moment which I felt pushed me away from doing war photography because I felt uncomfortable with this role. In fact, it sort of killed my hunger to continue as a war photographer. This is the camera that I used in Bestland. And I think one of the reasons why the pictures in Bestland turned out so well is especially some of the portraits. And there's a portrait I have of this man collecting the books in the school as if he was sort of trying to gather the knowledge that was existent in that school. And because when you take a picture with this camera, it's got such a quiet sound. It's not threatening, this camera. People don't feel ill at ease, whereas some of the very big digital cameras that I've had, they feel quite threatening. And this has something very, but it feels very comfortable. And people react to it in a different way than they do to large cameras. We're sitting in my home in France, and you can't see this, but the boxes and boxes of negatives and contact sheets and different pieces connected to my career. And I wanted to find a home for it, and it looks like that there's someone in the UK that's going to take it. And my feeling is of relief, of happiness, that they're not going to be sitting in some damp and dusty home in the middle of France, but they're going to be somewhere where they're going to be cherished, where they're going to be accessed by people who are interested in the work that I've done, and that they'll have a life long after I start working as a photographer and long after I'm here. I think that, in fact, one never ends a career as a photographer because one's always looking, even if it's looking because someone is paying to look at something, or whether you're just looking for yourself. There's this famous phrase by Nadar, the French portrait photographer, which says that in photography, like in everything, there are people who know how to see and others who don't know how to look. And I think that I've, among a lot of other photographers, had the gift of looking and of knowing how to look. And that's something which you never stop doing. So even if I don't end up working for a long more time for newspapers and magazines, I don't think I'll ever stop looking in the way that a photographer looks.